Chapter 4. A Red Clue. Nancy jerked one arm free from the attacker and fumbled for a light switch. Her fingers found it, and the ceiling lamp over the dining table went on. Clinging to her was Mrs. Thurmond, the cook. She wore an old-fashioned nightgown, and her head bristled with curlers. She let go of Nancy like a hot branding iron. "You!" she exclaimed. "Yes, me," Nancy replied, suppressing a smile. "I'm as surprised as you are, Mrs. Thurmond." "What's the matter?" demanded Ed Raleigh, as he and his wife, wearing robes and slippers, hurried in from the living room. Then Bess and George ran in from the portico, with Alice behind them. "Nancy, are you all right?" Soon Walt Sanders in nightclothes rushed into the kitchen. A moment later, Tex and Bud clumped in. Nancy wondered where Dave and Shorty were. "Bud and I were on watch," said the red-haired cowboy. "And we're checking on the stables when we heard the ruckus. What's up?" Mrs. Thurmond told her story. She had been asleep in her room, a small extension off the kitchen, when she had been awakened by someone coming into the kitchen through the screen door. "I sleep light," she explained. "First I was afraid to move. I listened hard, but I didn't hear anything more, so I decided to get up and take a look. Just as I stepped out of my room, what do I see but the screen door opening and a dark figure steps in. So I jumped him and hollered." Nancy smiled. "And I was him." Then she added, "There was an intruder here, Mrs. Thurmond, because I saw him come in." "He must have gone into the living room then," said Mrs. Raleigh. "There's no other way out." Mrs. Thurmond shook her head. "No, ma'am," she said forcefully. "That door to the living room squeaks, and I didn't hear a sound." George moved the door, and the hinges made a noise. "Then where did the intruder go?" Bess asked shakily. Nancy's keen eyes had spotted a trapdoor beside the old-fashioned stove. "Perhaps down there." "If he did," Ed Raleigh said grimly, "he's caught. That's the cellar, and this is the only way out. Dave," he ordered, looking beyond Nancy, "come with me." And from behind her stepped the tall cowboy. He was fully dressed and carrying a flashlight. She turned and saw Shorty Steele standing just inside the screen door. He, too, was in his working clothes. When had they arrived? And why hadn't they gone to bed after coming off patrol duty? As Ed Raleigh lifted up the trapdoor, Nancy said, "I'd like to go too, Uncle Ed." The man hesitated, and then said, "All right, but you stay well behind us." The cowboy turned on his flashlight, and Nancy followed the men down a flight of wooden stairs. She found herself in a shallow cellar, which was empty except for a row of shelves against one wall. At Nancy's request, Dave held his light downwards so she could look for footprints. But the earth floor was hard-packed, and she could see no marks on it. When the trio returned to the kitchen and reported no sign of the intruder, the cook shook her head. "He was a phantom," she declared. "Just like that horse." Now, Mrs. Thurmond," said Aunt Bet. "Maybe you were just so excited you didn't hear the intruder go through the living room door." The little woman looked indignant. "I have excellent hearing," she stated, "and that door positively did not squeak." Nancy found it hard to doubt Mrs. Thurmond's words. The young sleuth turned to Dave. "Did you just come in from the bunkhouse?" "No," Dave said quietly. "I was doing some extra investigating." Whatever that means, Nancy thought. She noted that Shorty had said nothing. Mrs. Raleigh did query the men. A few minutes later, everyone went back to bed except Tex and Bud. Nancy awoke at dawn, puzzled over the problem. Who was the intruder? What was he after? Where had he gone? Quietly she arose and dressed, then went to the kitchen to make herself a cup of tea. Not wanting to hear the big kettle of water, which stood on the old-fashioned range, she took a small pot from a hook on the wall and carried it to the sink. She turned one of the faucet handles, but no water came out. Surprised, Nancy tried the other, with the same result. "That's strange. I'll ask the girls about it." She hurried to the bedroom and woke them. Bess and George said this had not happened before, and George went to tell her aunt and uncle. In a short time, the hastily dressed rancher appeared, completely puzzled. He led the way past the stable and the corral to the small frame shed. Inside were the electric generator and pump. After examining the machinery, Ed Raleigh said one grim word: sabotage! He showed the girls where some of the bearings were missing. We'll need new ones before we can have any water. It's a shame, George declared. When do you think this mischief was done, and where were the guards? What difference does it make? Her uncle said with a sigh. The men can't be everywhere at once. What about the chief? Nancy asked. He didn't bark at the saboteur. Does this mean he knows him? Ed Raleigh's jaw tightened. I trust Sanders, Bud, and Dave with my life. They came highly recommended by friends of mine. As for the others, I accuse no man without proof. Nor would I, Nancy said quietly, and began looking for evidence. On the wooden floor were damp dabs of red earth. Outside the building was a wet patch of the same color, but the prints were too confused to be distinguishable. Whoever damaged the pump may still have this kind of mud on his boots, Nancy thought. The rancher's face was gray with worry. This pump will have to be fixed as soon as possible. After the windmill in the east meadow was wrecked, I had to start using this pump, which only supplied the house to water my cattle. There's another mill in the big meadow, but its supply is not enough for them. We're lucky to have one other source of spring water. The three girls volunteered to carry water to the kitchen. They went to get buckets from Mrs. Thurmond, who was pale and tight-lipped. She handed them kettles and large pots. Bess led the way around the house to the spring house, a windowless adobe structure built on the back wall of the kitchen. George opened the heavy wooden door, and the girls stepped down on the earthen floor. It was cool and so dim they could barely see the small stream of water coming from the pipe in the center. While waiting her turn to fill her kettle, Nancy went outside to look around. She saw that between the ranch house and the foot of the Shadow Mountain ran a heavy strip of woods which continued along the big meadow. That's where the phantom horse is supposed to appear, Nancy reflected. Just then Bess came from the spring house. Your turn, Nancy, she called. The young sleuth hurried inside and placed her kettle under the stream of water. While waiting for it to fill, she noticed a stone vat against the kitchen wall. It was about 3 feet square with a hinged wooden lid. That's where the old-timers store milk products and eggs, she thought. When Nancy reached the kitchen with her full kettle, Mrs. Thurmond was serving breakfast. As the girls sat down, Dave and Shorty came in. Nancy glanced at their boots. There was a damp red mud on both pairs. As soon as the men finished eating, Dave stood up. I'm going to Tumbleweed to get pump bearings, he said to Nancy. Mr. Raleigh said you wanted to do an errand in town. You can ride along with me. Nancy was glad the sheriff had not been mentioned. She said, I'll go, thank you, and I'll bring George. Dave scowled. I'll be in the pickup, he replied abruptly and walked out. Nancy hurried to her room to get the warning notes and the rattle. The pickup was parked in the yard, and as soon as Nancy and George had climbed into the cab, Dave started it. Without saying a word, he drove out of the ranch gate and turned onto a dirt road which stretched down the valley. The girls appeared to be relaxed, but they could not rid their minds of a distrust of Dave. Once he caught Nancy looking at his shoes. Yes, Miss Detective, he said. That's mud from outside the pump house. I was up before dawn this morning and thought I heard a noise there. I didn't find anyone, though. Must have scared off the pump wrecker, but he came back later. George asked why Dave was up so early, but he did not answer or speak again until they reached a small town with old-fashioned frame buildings. The cowboy parked the pickup on the main street. I'll meet you here in half an hour, he said, as he swung out of the truck. Nancy and George saw him go into a hardware store, several doors away. Before them was a building with a sign, Sheriff. As the girls entered the small office, a gray-haired man swiveled around in his chair and rose to greet them. I reckon you're Miss Drew, he said in a pleasant drawl. I'm Sheriff Curtis. His eyes twinkled. Ed Raleigh told me you're aiming to help him find what's causing the troubles at the ranch. George spoke up. And Nancy will, too. I sure wish you luck. After hearing Nancy's story and looking at the notes and the rattle, he said, I'll hang on to these as evidence and phone the state and Phoenix lawmen to keep an eye out for that hombre you saw at the airport. Keep me posted, he added gravely. And be careful, girls. Nancy thanked him and the callers left. They still had 20 minutes to spare. George said she wanted to purchase a cowboy kerchief in the general store. So Nancy strolled along looking in shop windows. The town seemed almost deserted, and many of the stores were not open yet. Ahead, in the center of the street, grew a large cottonwood tree with a wooden bench built around the trunk. Nancy walked to it and was about to sit in the shade when her eye was caught by a tall stack of Indian baskets outside the shop marked Mary Dear Gifts. Nancy crossed over to look at them, then glanced through the window. Startled at what she saw, Nancy almost cried out. The shop was empty, except for a man with a black kerchief covering his face to the eyes. He was crouching in front of an open glass case, scooping jewelry in a paper bag. Heart pounding, Nancy looked up and down the street for help. But there was no one in sight. Boldly she stepped to the open door of the shop. "Drop that bag," she ordered. With a startled gasp, the man whirled, then charged straight at her.